Greetings and felicitations, my minions. I am your evil doctor. I am back with another belated Golden Age special with my 10 subscribers milestone, which I achieved on June 29th, 2020. And since all 10 were family and friends, after this I will be celebrating those of you who don't know me and chose to subscribe to me anyways. So now we take a look at a brand new comic book, Daring Mystery Comics #1, which was published on October 30th, 1939. As you can see, it leans into the branding of Marvel Mystery Comics, no doubt as an effort to encourage the Marvel readers to try this comic, since company branding was not a thing yet. When we look at the cover, we're greeted by another important first. This is the very first cover Alex Schomburg ever did for Marvel. I know I said in the previous video that if you have Bill Everett doing a cover, you should use it. Well, that's not true if you have Alex Schomburg. Alex was known for his detailed, sensationalistic covers, often featuring a hero going up against strange, fiendish villains who are threatening a beautiful woman who's about to die in a very sadistic manner, which at no point shows up in any part of the comic book. In this case, we get a first look at the fiery mask without a fiery mask, about to use a mace to strike a cloaked gray-skinned man who has a futuristic gun that looks like it shoots fire. Tied to the front of a futuristic-looking car is a damsel in distress, with the whole setting appearing to be a futuristic world. And at the risk of spoiling things, none of this ever appears in the book. Schomburg would go on to do the vast majority of the covers for Timely for the next 7 years, and it all starts right here. I should also note that no number appears on the front cover. This usually only happens with the quarterly comics during the Golden Age, where a season replaces the number, but this was intended as a monthly comic. There was also a belief at the time that low numbers in comics were bad for sales, thinking people might not take a chance on a new comic. But in this case, I suspect it's the result of quality control problems that were still plaguing Timely as a result of being so new. So we come to our first feature, The Fiery Mask by Joe Simon. I've read this story before, but didn't notice it was created by Joe Simon. Joe Simon is an absolute legend in the comic book industry, and with partner Jack Kirby, co-created many comic book characters over the decades, including their most famous one with Timely. He would also become Timely's first editor, but at this point he was working for Lloyd Jacquet's Funnies Incorporated, a company which sold content to various comic book publishers, and this would be Joe Simon's very first story for Timely. And with another first, we get our first story title, The Fantastic Thriller of the Walking Corpses, with what will turn out to be an overly optimistic Chapter 1 as its designation. We had Jungle Terror in Marvel Comics #1, but that was a regular anthology story, and it was not intended to be an ongoing series. At this point, all stories were simply known by the name of their featured character. Eventually, all stories would have titles, but this would be the first in Marvel history. So the story begins with an introduction to physician Jack Castle, who was called to the office of Police Captain Benson, where he encounters a green light and a green man. So yet again, we have another first. Up until now, all the villains in the stories have been just garden variety criminals, with the exception of the Submariner, where he was the villain, and he was just going up against people. But here we get our first supernatural villain, and it's zombies! So Jack becomes paralyzed by the green ray, and is slowly being strangled by the green man, when Captain Benson draws a gun and shoots him. As the green man lays dying, he says the doctor will be angry, look out for the green ray, and that he's glad, probably because death is giving him a release from his torment. Jack is puzzled by all this, stating that the man didn't seem to be suffering from any known disease. The captain says this man was Peter Johnson, a harmless tramp who disappeared last year, and apparently there are 8 other people that have gone missing that may be tied into this case. So Jack tries to track down the last whereabouts of the missing men, only for it to lead nowhere. He stops near an office of an electric company and hits upon a brilliant idea. He decides to check the records of electric bills to find any that are unusually high. This is a tool that police use in real life to track down organized crime operations like grow ops, and I suspect that even back then this was done. Anyway, this leads Jack to a rundown house that has a rather unusually high electric bill. He knocks and is greeted by a rather surly zombie that is complaining about Jack's noise waking the dead. That is literally funnier than the entirety of all 3 pages of the one-panel jokes we saw in both issues of Marvel Comics. So Jack introduces himself as a meter reader and is immediately taken prisoner. He is led into a hidden passage and down underground while complaining about the lack of escalators. Just want to note that, like with Carl Burgos' Human Torch stories, Simon has placed a narration box at the bottom of a panel when it should be at the top. But having said that, his description of rows of lifelike bodies that seem to twitch now and then paints a pretty horrific picture. Jack is then led past a woman who is chained up in an Alex Schomburg way. Apparently she's the next step in the doctor's experiments, and her will is proving difficult to break. Jack hypothesizes that hypnotism is being employed by the doctor, which is not how hypnotism works, nor does it explain all the weirdness we've seen so far. As they pass by, the woman gives Jack a pitiful look. And here, I want to take a moment to appreciate Joe Simon's skill as an artist, as is depicted depiction of the woman's pleading look is perfectly captured. We then come to a ridiculous part where they are attacked by a giant buzzard that looks like it could be a robot. Supposedly this is part of their security system, where they're supposed to take out any of the useless ones. But since they simply attack anyone, I would suggest that their system is deeply flawed. My security system involves a book-shaped clone. What? So they make it into the laboratory, no thanks to the buzzards, where they encounter our first supervillain in Marvel history, not counting Namor, and our first mad scientist. The Doctor turns out to be a 10-foot green man that looks like a cross between the Hulk and Giant Man, with a beard. Jack is quickly captured and is strapped to an operating table. The Doctor tells Jack his plan to turn him into one of his minions and help him conquer the world. Jack mentions he's actually a doctor and is interested in his experiments, but the Doctor is having none of that. He then states that his machine harnesses the very elements, storms, wind, lightning. We then get a short origin story, as we find out he was born this way, and his size made him a recluse, and for 50 years he's worked on his experiments. I guess that makes him about 70 years old, and quite possibly a mutant. Anyway, he turns on his machine, and it seems to be having little effect on Jack, so the Doctor keeps upping the power more and more, until he puts it to full power, which causes his machine to explode. Jack finds himself glowing, but otherwise unscathed. The Doctor attacks Jack, but Jack now finds he has incredible strength and can easily overpower the not-so-jolly green giant. With the laboratory now in flames, Jack races to rescue the girl and then attacks the giant buzzards with super breath. Meanwhile, the girl, despite not knowing where she was a panel ago, goes into a deep exposition of how and why Jack gained his superpowers. Anyway, Jack leaps clear of the burning house and deposits the girl at her home and then takes off again without telling her his name. Later, Jack visits Captain Benson and tells him the whole story. He also tells him his plans to become a superhero with a costume and mask and call himself the Fiery Mask. In the final panel, we get a shot of Jack in his costume and a face shot of his fiery mask, and then ask us to follow the further adventures of the Fiery Mask, which would be hard to do since his next appearance won't be until Daring Comics number 5, and will only appear sporadically over the next year over 2 different titles during the Golden Age. It was a good first story by Joe Simon, but not without problems. The design of the Fiery Mask costume is very meh, and the name itself is kind of dumb. There were times when the characters were saying things that they shouldn't have any knowledge of. It's perhaps because Simon was trying to conserve dialogue and didn't want to reuse the same information. I think it would have worked better if the people with the actual knowledge were the ones saying those things. Also, the giant buzzards were just gratuitous and added nothing to the story. However, on the plus side, it was a solid origin story. The character of Jack Castle is fantastic, and his powers are pretty cool. In addition to super strength, he has power over wind, rain, electricity, and possibly light. Also, by Golden Age standards, Simon's art was fantastic. He, like Bill Everett, used larger panels, which makes his art shine, but he also uses dark inks to convey shadows and to set mood. This character deserved better, but unfortunately he was pretty quickly forgotten. But then again, so was pretty much every character introduced in Daring Mystery. So now we come to our second feature story, Soldier of Fortune, John Steele, by Larry Antoinette, under the pen name of Dean Carr. The story opens in an active battlefield with a World War I era tank and soldiers in red uniforms. Of course, the reality at this time was that Poland was already subjugated and the phony war had begun, where outside of a few potshots here and there were no active hostilities between the Allies and the Axis. The Allies, basically just Great Britain and France, were busy moving and readying troops and equipment along the German border and building fortifications. But none of that matters to these combatants, as we find an enemy soldier from an unnamed country about to shoot an unarmed nurse. Meanwhile, outside that damaged building, we meet John Steele for the first time, running to seek shelter from the enemy bombardments. John surprises the enemy soldier and promptly shoots the gun from his hand, because that's way cooler than just simply shooting him, and it's certainly much cooler to simply punch the enemy soldier in the face and knock him out, which is what John does. But if John was hoping to keep that soldier alive for some reason, it doesn't work, because at that moment, an enemy shell hits the building, instantly killing that soldier. Anyway, John asks the nurse what she's doing in the middle of the battlefield, and it turns out the nurse is an agent for the Allies with important information. However, they now find themselves behind enemy lines with no hope of escape. That is until John spies an anachronistic tank heading in their direction. John manages to sneak on top of the tank, which looks like it's made for ants, open the hatch, and subdue the 2 tank operators with the way cooler closed fist option. After he tosses out the 2 enemy soldiers, John then proceeds to drive into the same hut where the nurse is hiding, and manages to miraculously not run her over. Oh my god, this story is so ridiculous. I guess all I can do is strap in and enjoy the ride. So John and the nurse steal the tank and hope that none of the enemy notice as they head for the front lines. Unfortunately for them, a forward command receives information that a spy might be heading in their direction, so they need to stop all suspicious vehicles. When one of their tanks shows up unexpectedly and fires on them, they quickly realize that it is indeed suspicious and start firing back. A well-placed grenade manages to flip the tank on its side. John crawls out and tosses his own grenades back at the enemy, successfully destroying them. Soon afterwards, an enemy motorcycle and sidecar happens upon them. John manages to get the drop on them and hijacks their motorcycle while shooing away the enemy soldiers. John and the nurse are once again heading back to the front lines. However, the two enemy motorcyclists manage to find a communication site with a working telephone and tells their commanders where Steele and the nurse are heading. So the enemy sends out a plane loaded with bombs to go after their stolen bike. John sees this and starts to engage in evasive action. The plane drops a bomb and creates a crater in the path of the motorcycle, and John drives the bike off the road to avoid it and straight into a camouflage anti-aircraft gun nest, surprising everyone. This story is just nuts, and surprisingly, I'm here for it. So John recovers first and proceeds to punch out the two enemy gunners because, once again, always go for the cooler option. So John takes the anti-aircraft gun and turns it against the enemy plane, and for the first time, we get a clear view of the insignia on the plane. It's a Nazi swastika. This is the first time we see this in Marvel Comics, and we know for certain that the enemy is in fact the Germans, despite the weird red uniforms, and not some stand-in like Castile D'Or. So now both the plane and John are desperate to get a bead on the other. John gets a shot off while the plane drops the bomb. Both John and the nurse jump clear into a nearby foxhole as the bomb destroys the anti-aircraft gun. As they look back, they see that John's shot didn't miss as the German plane goes down in flames. So they get to the motorcycle, which somehow, miraculously, didn't get blown up by the German bomb, running again, and get to a nearby town where they promptly crash into a car. Turns out the car is carrying the very general they were looking for, and we find out that the nurse's name is Marie. So the information is delivered, and Marie departs with the general, leaving John Steele behind, craving some excitement. This was an interesting story. The art was kind of meh. Not the best, but not the worst either. Larry seemed at times to have problems with scale, especially with the tank that at times looked like it couldn't hold one person, let alone two. The German soldiers' uniforms were red for some weird reason, and much of the military equipment was very archaic, suggesting he was using very old reference materials. The story, as goofy as it was a lot of fun. One of the more enjoyable stories I've read so far. Much like the Human Torch story in Marvel Mystery Comics number 2, John Steele had to face setbacks, overcome them, advance before facing another setback. He basically had to earn his victories before he could move on, which is far different from the text story in my last video, where the Angel accomplished extraordinary tasks without facing any adversity. And I think that's what separates a bad character from a good one, and a bad story from a good story. I find the title of the story, Soldier of Fortune, an interesting choice. Now, a Soldier of Fortune is a name for a mercenary who fights for whomever pays him. There's no indication that John Steele is a mercenary. In fact, there's no indication of his nationality. He could be a British citizen in the British Army, or he could be an American serving in the British Army, as a lot did back then. But none of that means he's a mercenary. So I can't help but think that it might be a double meaning, in the sense that John is lucky in his outcomes, and plays a factor in his adventures. Now, unfortunately, this would be the only appearance for this character. As much as I would have enjoyed more stories, I understand why it wasn't continued. As I mentioned before, major hostilities had pretty much ceased. It wouldn't be until April of 1940 that it would become active again, with the British fighting the Germans in Norway, followed by the invasion of France in May, when the French were forced to surrender and the British were forced to evacuate to England. Having a war story when the war itself wasn't active was going to seem unrealistic, and when it did become active, it went badly for the Allies, which would make it seem like a slap in the face. So we come to our next new feature, The Texas Kid, Robin Hood of the Range, by a familiar name, Ben Thompson, who is also doing the Khazar stories in Marvel Mystery Comics. The story opens with the Texas Kid riding a trail at Red Rim Canyon when he spots a cabin on fire, and several masked men outside of it. He races towards the cabin, firing at the raiders and driving them off. The kid ends his pursuit and turns back to see if there's anybody in the cabin that needs help. We also discover that his horse's name is Spot, which, while unusual for a horse, especially one that is completely white and having no markings, I'm going to let slide because it's also refreshingly different. So he gets Spot to kick open the door and manages to grab a man, without dismounting I might add, and brings him to safety. Apparently the rancher was shot, and he tells the kid that the small ranchers are being driven off their land, and he had half his cattle and all his mortgage money stolen. He then dies before he can reveal the name of the leader of this operation. Please let it be Jim Gardley. That would be a plot twist nobody would see coming. As the kid rides off, he spots a clue in the form of a green hat that we didn't see on any of the raiders in the earlier panel. So the kid heads into a town called Placer City, which might be based on the very real Placerville in California, which was once a lawless frontier town founded during the California Gold Rush and had the rather dubious nickname of Hangtown. Anyway, the kid ties up Spot behind the hotel and puts on the green hat and wanders around town looking for the possible owner. He goes into a saloon saloon and starts asking questions. He then gets the immediate response of a gun being pointed at his back by a man named Luke, whom we can assume is not only the owner of the hat, but was one of the raiders at the farm. We also find out that his two companions are named Comanche and Trent. However, when Luke is momentarily distracted, the kid takes advantage using the bar mirror and is able to shoot the gun out of Luke's hand and then takes off running. The kid decides to hide out until nightfall, and later he finds the trio with the stolen money. He learns that they're going to hit a place called the Humboldt Ranch and decides to act by shooting out the light. The trio tries to get some light and finds that their stolen money gone, replaced by Luke's hat. Well, at least Luke got his hat back. So the next morning, the kid goes to the Humboldt Ranch and warns Humboldt about the upcoming attack. He also has a plan that Humboldt reluctantly goes along with, and a few hours later, the trio shows up making threats. Humboldt quickly gives in to their demands and gives them his money. As the raiders ride off, the kid follows them while Humboldt goes to town and throws a package into the bank. The package is addressed to the banker, a man named Wells, who takes it to his office. In it is a note from Luke saying they went to the hideout, and it includes money that has been cut in half. Meanwhile, Humboldt goes to the sheriff and asks for his help. Together they form a posse and start to trail a man whom I presume to be Wells. The kid reaches the hideout, only to be discovered by the outlaws. They tie up the kid and threaten him, demanding the money he took. However, Luke then sees Wells approaching the hideout. Wells questions Luke about why he was called to the hideout and why they brought a stranger to the cave. The kid reveals that it was part of his plan to out Wells as the man behind it all, as he was the sole beneficiary of the scheme to attack the small ranchers. Luke demands to know where the money is that he took, and the kid says they already have it, as Humboldt gave them the money torn in half instead of his own. Luke then pistol whips the kid, just as the sheriff and the posse show up to arrest the lot. Humboldt thanks the kid and asks what his name is. The story ends with the kid simply saying, "Folks just call me the Texas Kid." There is also a little blurb at the bottom that says, "Read the Texas Kid again next month," which, like every story in this issue, does not happen. This would be the only appearance for this Texas Kid. There would be another Texas Kid in his own series that ran for 10 issues from 1950 to 1952, but he is completely unrelated to this character. There was also the Kid from Texas that ran for 2 issues in 1957, and he does bear a striking resemblance to this Texas Kid. So he's probably based on the original. It being a coincidence seems highly unlikely. The story is nothing special. Yet another rich man trying to bully ranchers out so he can buy up their land cheaply. It's a similar story to the Masked Raider one in Marvel Comics #1. Also, the subtitle, Robin Hood of the Range, never comes into play, as at no point does the Texas Kid do any Robin Hooding. The character of the Texas Kid is pretty much your standard Western hero, and doesn't have much personality beyond that. He has no name or origin story, so he joins the Angel in that regard. The only memorable part of this story is the art. I'm starting to become a Ben Thompson fan. His work by Golden Age standards is pretty good. His figure work is excellent, and he does some great action scenes, especially at the start of the story. Comparing it to Al Anders' work on The Masked Raider, there is no comparison. Ben's work is just vastly superior. So this brings us to our next new feature, and our first appearance of magic with Monako, Prince of Magic, who is apparently a ripoff of Mandrake the Magician, at least in appearance. This was created by Larry Antoinette, the same guy who did Soldier of Fortune John Steele earlier in this issue. Anyway, the story opens with Monako seeing a young woman about to be run over by a car. So the Prince of Magic gestures, and suddenly the woman is crossing a pedestrian bridge. So it's going to be like that, eh? Anyway, it turns out that the woman's name is Josie, and she and Monako know each other, and he has saved her life before. Meanwhile, the car that tried to hit Josie passes by, and inside is an Asian man that recognizes Monako and calls him his old enemy. Both Josie and Monako both see and recognize him as well, an old foe that is named Mr. Muro, who has caused problems for both of them in the past. So Josie then asks Monako for his help. Apparently Mr. Muro is after Josie's brother Al, who has developed a new powerful explosive for the government. Muro wants to steal the formula and take Al prisoner. How Josie knows any of this is anybody's guess. Anyway, they hail a cab and head to Al's house. However, Muro and his henchmen have already reached Al's house, but not before Al has burned the formula and committed it to memory. The henchmen attack Al and eventually subdue him, allowing Muro a chance to drug him and take him to his car. Josie and Monako show up just as Muro leaves. They get out of the cab, and Monako pays $50 to the cabbie to follow the black car, which had been colored either green or red up to this point. Josie and Monako rush into the house and see that they are too late. So Monako wants to see what his vision has to report. Meanwhile, the cabbie decides he's just going to keep the cash and not follow the car, until he hears Monaco's voice coming from the back seat. We then get to see a ghostly apparition of Monako berating the cabbie. I'm assuming that this is some form of astral projection, and I must say, kind of cool. Monako is able to project what the vision is seeing onto a wall, so that Josie can also see what is going on. The vision finds Al and Muro and tries to stop them. A henchman thinks it's a ghost, but Mr. Muro is having none of that, and basically ignores the vision as he hustles Al behind behind a door that prevents the vision from following. So Monako tells Josie to stay put while he goes to the hideout. While there, he studies the door and comes up with a plan. He attaches a tiny rope ladder to the keyhole and shrinks himself down, Ant-Man style, and climbs through the keyhole before making himself big again. He briefly ponders which door to take before using magic to illuminate footsteps leading to the correct door. However, he inadvertently falls through a trap door, taking him directly to Muro. But before his henchmen can capture him, he creates multiple images of himself, which is a trick I've seen Dr. Strange use. Monako then uses more magic to produce disembodied fists to punch the various henchmen. Muro, meanwhile, waits patiently until Monako goes to a specific spot and traps him in an iron cage. I'm starting to think that Mr. Muro is not a magic user himself, but knows enough about magic to use science and engineering to create a counter to it, which is actually a pretty cool concept and a great idea as an adversary. Anyway, Monako and Al are now tied up in a cliché dungeon, and apparently Al knows Monako as well. So Muro tries torturing Al to reveal the formula for the new explosive, but Al still won't talk, so he tries another cliché, the swinging axe. This time Al is ready to reveal the secret, but Monako has an idea. He uses magic to take control of the axe, which now can talk. Honestly, as stupid as this is, I hope we get to see more of this. There is something humorous about inanimate objects being magically charmed and suddenly having opinions about things. Except for chairs. Chairs should never talk. Anyway, the axe flies around and cuts their bindings, and once free, Monako once again uses his Ant-Man trick to shrink both of them and hide in a crack in the wall. The henchmen discover both of their prisoners gone, and ultimately fail in tracking them down, so Muro decides to try something else. While this is happening, Josie decides to head to the hideout. Unfortunately, Muro sees her and promptly kidnaps her. Al and Monako escape the building just in time to see this happening, but are unable to catch up to them. They decide instead to head to Al's lab, fully expecting Muro and his gang to eventually go there. Meanwhile, Muro takes Josie to an abandoned tug, ties her up, and sets up a gasoline bomb. Back at the laboratory, Monako sets up a couple of magical traps, including a can that apparently Muro mistakes for the secret formula. When Muro reaches for it, it suddenly says, "Must not touch." Yes! But Muro ignores the warning and tries to pick it up anyways, only to burn his hand on it while it says, "Bernie burn!" Then presumably a different can starts to smoke, producing a giant image of Monako. This freaks out the henchmen so much that they run away in terror, and Muro has no choice but to follow. Al and Monako give chase, but Muro manages to make it to a float plane and escapes while vowing revenge. Monako and Al hear Josie's cry for help from the nearby tugboat and get her to safety before the boat explodes. The story ends with Monako musing about how much a threat the Muro is proving to be. I must say, this story is much better than I remembered it being the first time I read it. One of the problems, which is not the problem of this story, but still factors in, is my familiarity with Doctor Strange, and the fact that in the modern Marvel universe, magic has very specific rules and limits to what it can and cannot do. So I can't help but color how I see the use of magic in the Golden Age. It's impossible for me to go into this blindly and react to it as if it's my first time encountering it. And certainly with a lot of Golden Age magicians, their abilities are basically like reality warping genies, where they can do anything they can imagine. In the beginning of the story, I thought that was where it was going with Monako conjuring up a bridge out of nowhere, even if it was a temporary construct. We also saw that with the talking objects, but I can give that a pass because it was hilarious. And with the shrinking, which happens to be the first time shrinking was used as a superpower in Marvel history, magic too often can be used as a crutch to help get a character out of tight spots. However, we also saw a couple of examples that were completely compatible with modern magic use. So it's a mixed bag. Monaco's costume was terrible, a complete rip-off of Mandrake the Magician, not to mention the silliness of a literal sorcerer wearing the clothes of a stage magician, though the fact that Doctor Strange wears such an iconic costume unfortunately also colors that perception, perhaps unfairly. Monako as a character is fine, nothing special. We also get no origin story, and apparently much like the Angel, has already been doing this for a while. Likewise, the art is pretty mid, nothing special. The story, on the other hand, was pretty good. We get our second supervillain, and possibly our first recurring villain. Muro's use of science and engineering as a counter to magic is a pretty neat idea that I want to see explored more. Unfortunately, we won't see Monako again until Daring Mystery Comics number 4, and we will only see him again 2 more times after that, all in Daring Mystery Comics.
I've read it, so now you have to listen to me talk about it.
Yes, that means it's time to look at this issue's text story. So the title of this story is, we apparently don't have one. I double-checked online with an original copy, and it most definitely was missing in the production. It was probably supposed to be called something like Thundering Terror, but I will just call it blank. It was written by Ray Gill, the same man who wrote Burning Rubber in Marvel Comics #1. It's also a shorter text story with a large illustration by L. Anders, the creator of The Masked Raider, taking up most of the first page. So the story opens with people yelling, including the obligatory, "My baby, my baby!" as a thundering terror descends on the tiny mining town of Gold Creek. A stampede of wild horses has surged through the town, destroying buildings and killing anything that got in its way. In just 10 minutes, the town is completely destroyed, leaving just 5 people who watch the whole thing unfold from a safe distance. Wade Duncan, his wife, who apparently didn't get her baby, the banker, Mr. Hastings, the blacksmith, Hank Wells, and Spud Clark, the cowhand. They talk about how the horses acted awfully strange, even for wild horses, or horses that have gone mad. They speculate that this could be an intentional act, perhaps by some crooks from Chelsea City wanting control over Gold Creek. However, they have no proof. So 3 of them, Wade, Spud, and Hank, go after the herd. When they encounter the herd, the horses seem to have lost their aggression. They manage to capture one horse, and an examination shows the horse didn't seem sick at all. Wade then finds an incision at the back of the head, which inside contained a piece of metal. A quick examination of other horses show that they all have the same incision and the same inserted piece of metal. The 3 of them ride to Chelsea City and go to a brand new radio station where they go in with guns drawn, and after a huge fight, they capture and tie up 6 men and drag them out under arrest. Apparently, the Chelsea crooks used the radio signals to cause the metal pieces to drive the horses mad and direct them anywhere they wanted. The story ends with Mr. Hastings bemoaning that this little experiment had to result in the destruction of their little town. So there's not much to say about this story. I enjoyed Ray's first story in Marvel Comics #1 more. I thought there was a little too much dialogue, and the casual dismissal of the Duncan's child was a bit much. The basic premise was fine, even if I'm not sure how feasible it would be in real life. But it is a fantasy book, so... Anyway, we come to our next new feature, Flash Foster at Midwestern by Bob Wood. So this looks like it's going to be a sports-themed story, as it opens during a football game, as Flash Foster scores a touchdown for Midwestern. There is a real Midwestern University in the U.S., but it's a medical school, and though founded in 1900, it didn't get named Midwestern until 1993. So it's safe to say it's a completely fictional university, as is their next opponent, Hale, which is clearly a stand-in for Yale University. If Midwestern beats Hale next Saturday, then they get an invite to the Rose Bowl, which is very real. Duh. Apparently Midwestern is heavy favorites to beat Hale, as we meet Nick Bruno working out a way to fix the game so he can make a huge amount of money with a Hale victory. So we find out that Flash Foster is set to marry a Boston debutante by the name of Connie Hodges. Nick plans to kidnap Connie at the Friday night pep rally dance and force Flash to do his bidding. So it's Friday night, and Flash has to leave early to make sure he has plenty of rest for the game. He tells Connie he will take her home, but he wants to talk to his coach first. With that opening, Nick's flunky steps in and tells Connie that her mother has been seriously hurt and that he will take Connie to her. So they kidnap Connie and drop her off with another Bruno flunky by the name of Blinky. Nick and his main henchman then go pay Flash a visit. They knock on his door and tell Flash that he has to make sure Midwestern loses tomorrow, or else something bad might happen to Connie. This riles up Flash, who starts punching Nick and his gun-wielding henchman, demanding to know where Connie is, until the henchman, whose name we find out is Pat, knocks out Flash with the butt of his gun. So the next morning, a guy by the name of Shorty finds Flash on the hotel room floor and tells him he has to get to the stadium and that he will drive Flash there. Flash tells Shorty the whole story, but vows to play his best anyway. However, Flash has trouble concentrating on the game. Flash is heading for a sure touchdown, but doesn't see a Hale tackler and fumbles the football on the 5-yard line. Later in the quarter, Flash misses a tackle that allows Hale to score their second touchdown. Flash is pulled from the game after the first quarter, and while he sits on the bench, Shorty runs in and tells him that he found Nick Bruno's hideout. So Flash and Shorty take off, driving fast enough to attract the attention of a highway patrol officer. They reach the hideout, and Flash immediately goes after Bruno and tackles him before he can fire his gun. As Pat comes out with a knife, Flash tosses Bruno at him, knocking both guys out as Connie comes running out. While this is happening, the patrol officer pulls up, demanding to know what is happening. Flash mentions the kidnapping, while Shorty says he's got both guys tied up. I would love to know what happened to Blinky. Maybe he went on a snack run. Anyway, the patrol officer recognizes Flash and wonders why he isn't at the game. Flash explains that he needs to get back to the game and that Shorty can explain what's going on. So Flash and Connie head back to the stadium while listening to the game on the radio. We find out that Hale is up 21-6 in the fourth quarter, with about 5 minutes left in the game. There's 4 minutes left when Flash asks the coach to put him back in the game, which he does, figuring it won't make a difference. Flash comes comes in and makes a spectacular interception at his own 1-yard line, and then runs it back 99 yards for a touchdown. Flash then passes the ball to a teammate to score the extra point. This was during a time when you can score converts through either kicking or from a regular scrimmage, as what was done here. So the score is now 21-13 with 2 minutes to go, and the ball is kicked off to Hale, and it looks like they're about to run it back for their own touchdown when Flash tackles the returner and forces a fumble that Midwestern recovers. Flash goes back in, and they execute a flea flicker play that has Flash passing the ball deep for a 70-yard touchdown. The point after is unsuccessful. Hale gets the ball back, but then turns it over on downs. Perhaps they were trying to run out the clock. Perhaps they didn't want to risk missing a field goal and having Midwestern running it back. But either way, it's now only seconds left on the clock. Midwestern is now only down by 2, and the crowd is going wild. So with so little time left, Midwestern tries a field goal from their own 35, which Flash kicks and makes it before time expires, winning the game. This might be the most unrealistic part of this story. At this point in history, the NFL had goalposts on the goal line, while the college football organization, the NCAA, had the goalpost at the back of the end zone. So Bob Wood either forgot about where the goalposts were located, and he thought Flash was kicking a 65-yard field goal, which, while extremely tough, is doable, or he remembered and had Flash kick a 75-yard field goal, which has never happened in history. He should have had the ball further up the field to make it more realistic. Either way, the story ends with Midwestern getting their invite to the Rose Bowl, and we get a promo for the next issue for the Rose Bowl game, and the promise of a villain named The Dip. Of course, once again, this never happens. This would be Flash Foster's only appearance, and the Dip never gets to see the light of day. So this was a pretty good story, where the game-fixing subplot was the least interesting thing about it. The field goal at the end aside, it's clear that Bob Wood knows the game of football, and it felt like a fairly accurate portrayal of how the game is played. I'm more familiar with Canadian football and its history, but it's not that much different from the American game. Back then, players would play both offensively and defensively, as well as handle the kicking duties. So everything Flash was doing was perfectly reasonable, and I've seen many games with outcomes not too different from what we see in this story.
54 yards, he hit one like this in the warm-ups. Here's Osbaldison, lots of leg, it did!
I was at this game when a game-winning field goal sent my beloved Tiger Cats to the Grey Cup, so I can absolutely relate to this story. On the other side, though, I'm not a fan of the art. Wood has a rather cartoony style, which, with the right artist, can work, but in this case, I think it falls flat. So our next feature is called Phantom of the Underworld by Maurice Gutworth, with a story called Case of Perron, which becomes our second feature with a story name. This features a character named Doc Denton, which is promoted on the front cover, but with the name Doc Doyle instead. Now, the reason for this is that Gutworth originally created this character as Doc Doyle for Centaur Comics and Keen Detective Funnies #3, published on August 29th, 1938. So since the character was published with a different company, they decided to change his name for daring. But clearly the change never made it to the cover before it was published. Skill issue, no doubt. The character of Doc Doyle only lasted one issue, but interestingly enough, was replaced by a character by the name of Dean Denton for the next issue. I can't help but think that Gutworth renaming his character Denton was a dig at Centaur. Anyways, the story opens with a mob boss being operated on. We find out that his name is Perron, and that he will make a full recovery, much to the disappointment of Doc Denton. So as part of his investigation, Denton decides to pose as the mob boss's surgeon, Dr. Stewart. Denton then meets with one of Perron's goons, who offers him money and a chance to make more money, which Denton accepts. Denton then gives the money over to Stewart and tells him to use it to go on a vacation. Later, Perron seems to be having problems with a wound and sends for Denton. Denton then tells the nurse, whom we found out earlier is named Andress, to go at 1:30 a.m. and notify the police to raid the house at 241 Melbourne Road. So Denton goes to Perron's house and tells him that this will be the only time helping Perron because of the risk. This reminds me of the masked raider in my last video, just acting suspicious enough to get an invite to join a gang. And here Denton is being skittish enough to make sure the gang doesn't suspect that he might be an undercover agent. Anyway, the police raid the place, right on schedule. Doc gets arrested with the rest of the gang, while Perron escapes. The next morning, the papers report that Dr. Stewart has been suspended because of his association with the Perron gang, giving Denton the in he needs to join the gang. So after investigating where Perron's new hideout might be, Denton goes to Louisville to set up a practice, with Nurse Andress assisting. There is a Louisville in New York State near the Canadian border, which had a population of about 1,500 people in 1939. It seems to match the story details, so I'm going to assume that this is indeed the place where this is happening. While they're talking to the local sheriff, they see Perron's gang performing a holdup. The sheriff wasn't armed, and he had to let the gang escape. Meanwhile, Denton and Andress head back to their office, expecting a call from Perron's gang, which indeed happens. So Denton gets taken to see Perron, who has apparently been shot once again in the exact same arm.
This is weird. Not only have you been shot in the same arm, it hit the exact same spot as your previous gunshot injury. What are the odds of that?
I don't understand. My previous doctor said if I planted a magnet in my arm, it would deflect bullets.
You've got all the luck, Perron.
Denton manages to remove the bullet with no problems. Perron then tells Denton that he can't leave, which Denton agrees to, while telling himself that this might be to his benefit. Later, Perron starts to complain about dizziness, and Denton asks to look at his eyes. Denton then tells Perron that it appears he has a contagious eye infection that might cause him to lose his eyesight. Denton then tells the gang that they all need to be injected to prevent the infection from spreading. So Denton sends one of the goons to his doctor's office with a note for Nurse Andress. She returns with the goon and the serum she prepared herself. Before Denton can give the injection to Perron, he asks that it be tested on Andress first. Here we are told that the serum causes temporary blindness. With that done, Denton injects Perron and the entire gang, and then hustles Andress out to the phone before the gang knows what has happened. The gang then realizes that they've been tricked when they start all going blind, and they react to that by taking out their guns and shooting wildly. Well, if they were smart, they probably wouldn't be criminals. Honestly, I kind of expected the story to end here with all the gang having shot and killed each other. Instead, Denton makes it to a phone and calls the police, and then decides to try to bluff Perron by using a pipe as a gun and get him and his gang to surrender. Shortly after that, the police arrive and arrest the entire gang. A few hours later, Nurse Andress has regained her sight. Denton thanks her, and she in return offers to help him again if the need arises. The story ends with Denton thinking his next adventure is going to be a pleasant one. At the bottom of the panel, we get a note saying there will be another Doc Denton story in the next issue, which, like every other such notation in this issue, is a complete lie. As far as I know, this will be the very last appearance of Gutworth's Doc character, which is too bad, because I actually enjoyed this story, as well as his first appearance in the Centaur comic. Doc Doyle/Denton is a good character. In his first appearance as Doc Doyle, we find out that he actually went to medical school, but decides to join the police force instead. As Doc Denton, we're only told he's a master surgeon, but not told why. You pretty much have to read the Centaur story to understand why he has so much medical knowledge for a police detective. The story itself is pretty good. Another undercover story, which answers my question in my last video on how common such stories were. Apparently quite common. Undercover work was first developed in the early 19th century, and by the early 20th century, most police forces and investigative bureaus had it as part of their policing. Maurice Gutworth's art is interesting. He either uses a lot of reference work, or he uses a lot of tracing, giving it a more photorealistic look. He uses it to good effect here, and with the heavy use of shadows, gives it a bit of a film noir feel to it. So next we get a one-page trivia segment on the military, entitled Wartime Wonders by Harry Francis Campbell, where we get 6 different factoids with a military theme. The first one talks about the development of cannons on planes having started in the World War, which is good to know. Otherwise, people will think the First World War dogfights involved pilots making faces at one another. I love also how it's referred to as the World War, and not the Great War. It being called the World War was strictly an American term. Of course, it won't be long before everyone will be calling it the First World War or World War I. Most of the rest of the factoids seem to be of a dubious nature. The attrition rate talked about in planes seems on the high side, and doesn't take into account things like pilot skill and plane performance. I couldn't find evidence that any of the scrap steel from the scuttled German fleet at Scapa Flow were used for military production. Battleships don't move when firing broadsides. Apparently it violates the laws of inertia. And explosives made from air and wood? Ha! Don't make me laugh. However, the one thing that turned out to be true was the man that fell out of a plane and then fell back in. His name was Graham Donald, a British airman, and it happened in 1917 while flying a Sopwith Camel during an attempt at flying a loop. Color me impressed. And so this brings us to our final feature, Barney Mullen, Sea Rover, by Charles Pearson. The story opens in Lisbon, Portugal, where Barney is looking for cargo to ship. A man wants to ship gold filigree to Rotterdam, but it's dangerous because it's a war zone and cargo ships are often targeted. Apparently gold filigree is intricate metalwork like chains and rings, so essentially gold jewelry. Anyway, this doesn't faze Barney, who must be really desperate for a job. So Barney hires a crew and then fills up the ship with sand, for ballast apparently, because he's only carrying the jewelry. Really, Barney? You couldn't find any other cargo to ship? It doesn't seem like a very good business model. How do you expect to make any money? Don't you be walking away from me! Anyway, Barney sets sail, and it doesn't go unnoticed by a spy, who assumes the sacks of sand is grain being transported, and suggests the cargo ship be intercepted. So an armored cruiser encounters Barney, and asks him to halt, but Barney spies a fog bank, and decides to try to make a run for it, with the cruiser firing at him to try to get him to stop. He makes it into the fog bank, and after several hours, Barney hopes he has completely lost the cruiser, only for the fog to lift, and having the cruiser right there, having stuck to Barney like glue. I absolutely love this. The protagonist tries a gambit to outfox his adversary, only for it to completely fail. Anyway, as luck would have it, the cruiser is spotted by what I presume to be a German bomber, making the cruiser an Allied ship, and starts to bomb them with the cruiser firing back. The bomber radios a nearby sub that quickly finds the cruiser and sinks it, and then launches a torpedo at Barney's ship, which hits, but it doesn't seem to do much damage. Apparently the sandbags in the hold seem to protect the ship, somehow. But no sooner has that crisis passed than another one pops up in the form of a mutiny. A group of sailors decided they had enough with the danger and wanted to be let off at the next port. A fight ensues, and the mutiny is put down, with the mutineers being put in the brig. However, some of the crew were injured in the melee, so they have to go to the nearest harbor anyway to get a doctor. So they reach a French fishing village and get a doctor who, after fixing them up, tells them they should be fine until they reach Rotterdam. But before they can leave, a couple of French town officials come aboard, wanting to see Barney's sailing papers, and upon seeing that he's carrying gold, the official says that the ship must be detained, but they imply that a bribe could smooth things over. Barney will have none of that, and throws both men overboard. Barney's ship now steams away at full speed, and are finally in sight of Rotterdam when the final catastrophe strikes. The engine boiler blows up, causing the ship to sink. The shipping agent meets the survivors in the lifeboats, bemoaning the loss of the cargo so close to the end of the journey. Barney then tells them the cargo is fine, since he stowed them on the lifeboats, and apparently he doesn't care he lost the ship, since he was being paid enough that it didn't matter. So that was the final story. A good story with its twists and turns. This, like so many other stories in this issue, would be the only appearance for Barney Mullen, which is too bad, considering some of the harrowing tales of the merchant marines trying to navigate to Europe in the Second World War. It could have been a good ongoing series. The art was fine. It mixed a cartoony style with some detailed scenes. It's much like Paul J. Loretta's style in American Ace, and it works. Unlike Bob Wood's Flash Foster, where there really wasn't much detail to help flesh out the art. Makes me think of Tintin by Hergé, where he used cartoony figures, but realistic backgrounds to great effect. So that was Daring Mystery Comics #1, and overall, a pretty good first issue. The highlights being the first appearance of Joe Simon and the Fiery Mask, and Soldier of Fortune John Steele, bringing up the rear with the Texas Kid, despite some stellar artwork by Ben Thompson. It's a shame that Daring Mystery characters were never given the same chance to grow and develop like their Marvel counterparts. But speaking of Marvel, I will be back with my recap, reaction, and review of Marvel Mystery Comics #3 for my belated 25 subscriber special. So until then, stay evil. I'm evil. Oh my God, physician, doctor.